Okay, and we're going to go live on Facebook as well. So I'll just do that. So if you do have any problems with sound or anything, or connectivity in Zoom, you can also watch the session on Facebook. You can't comment there, but you can follow the session there too. Okay, that looks good. Good, right, looks like we're going live on Facebook too. Perfect, so before I hand you all over to Andy, I'd just like to introduce him a little bit. So, Andy Keedwell has been involved in education for over 30 years, working in South and East Asia, the South Caucasus, India, Eastern Europe, the Middle East and East Africa as a teacher, trainer, and English language teaching manager. His recent work involves communities of practice in Romania and Myanmar and supporting newly qualified teachers in Europe. So such a wealth of experience. We're really, really lucky to have you here this morning. And it's over to you, Andy.
Thank you very much, Jo. Thank you.
I'm here if you need me.
Lovely, thank you.
Okay.
Very nice to see everyone. And especially can I say a big hello to, I noticed some of the countries that people were from. Can I say a big hello to people from Azerbaijan and people from Myanmar, which are both countries that I remember very well from working there. I hope that you enjoy our presentation today. Thank you. I'll just share my screen so that you can see. And there we go, thank you. And you'll see that my presentation is called Bending the Rules. One of my suggestions might even be to throw all the rules away. And just like any other session that we have some objectives. So in my session, I'll be talking especially about why language is, I've used the word messy deliberately. Messiness is almost like a concept, which I think is especially relevant to language. Language is difficult. Language kind of wriggles through our fingers. Language changes all the time. They will be some of the ideas that I'll be discussing today. And because language is messy, it can be very difficult to codify, to break down into rules. So one of my big suggestions will be today, will be bending the rules, forgetting about the rules. And thinking
Hi everybody, it looks like we've lost Andy. Can you just let me know if you can hear me okay in the chat? Let's see if he can come back. You can hear me, okay. Okay, great. All right, well, we really want to hear what he's got to say, so I'm sure there won't be any problem. I'll just wait for a moment, see if he can reconnect. And thank you for all your comments. Okay, let's see if he can come back. So tell us in the chat why you wanted to hear this session this morning and what you hope to hear from Andy. Let's see if we can send him some good vibes and get him back. So tell us about your grammar teaching. There's an interesting question about what do you think he means by language being messy? Yeah. Why is language messy, do you think? Okay, so Layla says how to put rules without being too strict. Right. Yeah, okay. And why is it important not to be strict with rules, Layla? Nadina says, I know Andy personally and he's amazing. All his ideas are useful. That's great. I really hope we do get him back. Okay. Right, so people are saying they're here to spend their morning with like-minded people. There are a lot of rules. Yes, messy because it has a lot of exceptions. Right, so that's the difficulty, isn't it? Do you find that as a teacher, you teach a rule, you want to help students, but then you find later that there's actually lots of exceptions and it makes life quite complicated. Yes, difficult to cope with. The rules are far beyond the situational use in the real world. Right, yeah. Yeah, so sometimes it's better just to have a, you know, like a kind of a general rule that works most of the time, but not emphasize it.
Thank you, many apologies.
Yes, Andy, we're very happy to
back.
see you
Thank
back.
you.
You're back. Okay, I'm going to disappear. Back over to you.
Thanks. My profuse apologies to everyone. I'm afraid I lost connectivity. My provider in the UK is not the best of providers, and I'm very sorry to have interrupted everything. Anyway, thank you. Let's just move on. Let's just find what our original. Again, just 1 second. Many apologies, everybody.
No worries, Andy. We're very happy to see you back. We were just talking about why maybe language is messy. So now we're even more.
That's exactly what I'm going to move on to now. Thank you. Can you see my screen now? No.
Not yet.
No, not yet. No, sorry. Just 1 second. Many apologies. I hate it when this happens. There we go.
Okay.
Thank you.
There we go.
Yeah, there we go. Thank you very much. Thank you. Yeah. Why? Okay. Well, why will be an answer? I'll answer in just a second. But before we move on, would you like to have a look at the screen here? And here are some activities which are in some ways similar to learning a language. So would you just like to have a look? Which of these activities do you think is most like learning a language? Is it, for example, riding a bicycle? Is it learning to walk? Just have a look and just choose one. And if you like, you can type it into chat. We'll come back to these in just a second. But if you think about them, they fall into some different kinds of groups. One group are ways such as learning words in a play, which are highly structured. One group makes use of systems where we're doing things like learning to play cards or learning to play chess. And another set of activities is where things happen very naturally, like learning to ride a bicycle or to swim or to walk when you're a baby. And one of my suggestions will be to think about those activities where things happen naturally. Just before I ask connectivity, Jo had a really sensible question, and she said, why is language messy? Why am I suggesting that language is messy? We'll move on to that now, and I think there are two really important reasons. The first one is connected to rules, and you'll find that in this session, I make use of my family a little bit. Both of my sister and my brother-in-law are both science and maths teachers. And when I was preparing this presentation, I was looking for some rules, the kind of rules that you might find in science. So, for example, if you add sodium to chlorine, you get salts. Gas is inversely proportional to its volume. There's a gas called helium. This isn't a mistake. Helium does actually boil at a temperature almost 200 degrees below zero. And these are rules. These are natural laws of science, and we find the same kind of thing as in maths. They're rules because they're always true. They're rules because there are no exceptions. As language teachers, we use those words, rules and laws, quite frequently ourselves. One of my suggestions about language messiness will be, how accurate are those rules? Are there really rules that conduct and decide how language works in the same way as these rules about science? As I say, there are no exceptions. When we add sodium to chlorine, we always get salt. And here are some examples of the kind of rules that we talk about in the classroom. Probably all of us have said at least one of these things at different times. Plural nouns take plural verbs. English is an SVO language. Subject always comes before the verb. Rules for comparatives. Rules for uncountables. Run, walk, fly, swim are intransitive. No object. Let's have a look. Here's rules number 1 to number 5. Think of our definition of rules before. Do you think these rules are true? Do you think these rules are false? Are they always true? Can we describe them as rules? And again, if you'd like to put an idea in the chat box, please do. Okay. The moderators can feed back to me. Do you think these rules are true? Do you think these rules are false? Here are some more. If you have a look at number 6, and number 7, number 8, I've heard many teachers in the classroom using all of these as examples of rules of language which happen. The present simple describes events which happen every day. The present continuous describes events which are happening now. Shall plus infinitive, all very familiar to us. In number 9, think about these statives. We don't use these verbs with the present continuous. All of us will be familiar with that order of adjectives. Size, age, shape, color, material. So again, just have a think. Are these rules? Are they true? Are they false? Would you like to put some ideas into the chat box? What do you think? Are they true or are they false? Joe's question a little bit earlier was, what do I mean by messiness? And one aspect of that messiness is just what you can see here. Here are some rules. They're all very learnable. They're all very neat. We can give them to learners. They can take them away. They can learn them off by heart. And unfortunately, they are not rules. The reason is because in every case, we can find exceptions. And all we need to do is to look at how language is really used. And we can see that those rules, which I put in inverted commas, all tend to break down. The first one, rule number 1, this came from a question from some Egyptian teachers I was working with, who said one day, can a plural subject take a singular verb? Well, no is the answer. But when we look at real life, we find that happens quite frequently. 3 days off is just what I need. $10 is quite enough. Okay. English is a subject, verb, object language. What we find inversion all the time. Those rules for comparatives. When we look at the real world, when we look at how language is really used, we find they don't work. And all of that work that we do about why countable nouns are singular, we often use the subject of food, but really, rubbish. Just about all of those words for food and drink that we look at can have a plural. Two examples straight off the internet: coffees of the world, 3 teas a day, and transitive verbs. So many verbs can be both transitive and intransitive. They don't fall into those neat, nicely compiled lists. Run a shop, walk the dog, fly a kite, swim a mile. Very different from what our rules stated earlier. Some more examples, this time is with tenses. If we look at number 6, here's a present simple verb talking about the future. If you look at 7, here's present continuous talking about things that happen all the time. English doesn't even have a future tense. Statives, dynamic verbs. So many of those stative verbs we can use in the present continuous. I'm thinking, I'm understanding, I'm wanting. And if you have a look at rule number 10, yeah, sure. I can say a large, modern, comfortable hotel. I can say a modern, large, comfortable hotel. I can say a comfortable, large, modern hotel. I can do anything I want, okay? Because by messiness, just what I mean, that language doesn't follow these rules. So one big aspect of language, it's not rule-based. It's got much more in common with something like the weather. There are patterns to how things happen, just as they happen with the weather. So, in answer to Joe's question a bit earlier, one big aspect of messiness is that language doesn't follow the rules we want it to follow. It wriggles around, it slips through our fingers. The second aspect of messiness that I'd like to bring up today is to think about language change. And so many of you will be familiar with the idea of that language is changing all the time, from day to day, from generation to generation. But I'd just like to have a look at some examples. First of all, thinking about grammar. And if you look on the left of the screen, you can see some expressions which are on the way out. If you look on the right of the screen, you can see some expressions which are already in, and things which have happened during my lifetime to language. And as obviously you can see, an older person, things that I notice in language happen. Have a look at on the way out. We spend so much time carefully helping our learners to understand that they must say, if I were a millionaire. As a language teacher and a native speaker, I have to struggle to remember to say that during the class itself, because so much of the time we just ignore that advice and use if I was. If I were is very much on the way out. Shall is on the way out. I know language teachers I've worked with have often said that their own training or grammar books that they use will say that shall is only used in the first person. Shall's disappearing, it's on the way out. It will disappear sooner or later. With whom did he discuss the issue? It's so much more common to say, who did he discuss the issue with? And even words like may, which we regularly teach learners, it's much more frequent now to say can. Words on the way in. And as I say, as somebody who is older, how are you? I'm good. Is something I would never say. It's something which has happened during my lifetime. Mine would always be I'm well, but I'm good is so common now. I'm so not interested in. Use of verbs like impact, where a noun is used as a verb. Impacts on is something which has happened during my lifetime. And words like that to describe kind of gender-free ideas as well. So language is changing all the time. For the purposes of this presentation, I wanted to find out some real examples of language change. Earlier on, I mentioned that my sister and my brother-in-law are both science teachers. Their children are, well, my niece is 19 and my nephew is 23. And a few weeks ago, I sat them down and said, it's a Sunday afternoon, they had little else to do. Please, can you tell me as many words that you would use that you think I'd have no idea what they mean? So we're thinking about youth slang. And here are some of the examples they came up with. They came up with hundreds of words, which I have never heard. But here are some expressions which I didn't know until last week. Let him cook, a simp, ram, swag. Melissa was saying the only one that she knew was slay the day, on the graft, trumpet, riz, bear, and whip. If you know all of these, brilliant, well done. You're a world expert on the slang that's used by young people. If you know any of them, very well done. If you don't know any of them at all, don't worry. Okay, I didn't. All of these were completely new to me. At the end, after the session, also we'll share a handout with you, and you'll find that most of these words are on there as well. I've included the examples in the handout. But apart from being a male sheep, what does ram mean? Swag to me is something that a burglar carries, things that he's stolen. What's all these words about chopping things on the graft? A whip to me is a kind of instrument that you use to direct a horse. But to young people in Britain today, all of these have a different meaning, which you can find out here. Here are the answers. So a whip is a car, bear can mean a lot, some words to do with flirting, someone who flatters too much is a simp, and swag and riz are the kind of things that you really want to have if you are 19 and you want to impress your friends. So there's our second reason for that kind of messiness happening. Language is changing all the time. And to me, as a native speaker, two young native speakers can very quickly provide words and expressions which I've never heard before. So, messiness. Language is messy because it doesn't have many, in fact, maybe it doesn't have any rules at all. Nor does something like the weather, nor does something like the economy. Things happen, but we can't always predict that they will happen. I live in Yorkshire, in the north of England, which is usually a cold, rainy place. But last year, Yorkshire was hotter than Cairo. Completely unpredictable, didn't follow any rules, but that was the pattern that was happening last year. If we talk about language rules, I think that we're giving learners a false impression. We're encouraging them to think of language in a way that isn't true. Yeah, it looks great. Learners can go away, they can learn the rules, they can parrot the rules or learn the rules by heart. But that isn't really how language works. And when I've discussed this with teachers, their question, quite sensibly, has always been, okay, so at lower levels, at elementary levels, what do we do? At pre-intermediate or elementary level, how can we help learners to understand that they are not rules? But I have some suggestions in just a second, but I think key is helping learners to see these are things that usually happen or generally happen. Yeah, okay. The present continuous is often used to describe things that are happening now. Often, usually, generally. The present simple often describes things which happen every day. Yeah, English is a subject, verb, object language, except when we want to use inversion. So again, just like the weather, thinking about things that usually happen or thinking about things that generally happen. And this applies to pronunciation. Be very skeptical of rules of pronunciation. There are so many different exceptions. Be very skeptical of things like rules that talk about stress and which syllables that we put stress on. They don't work. There are so many exceptions that we can't describe them as rules. All of us are familiar with how complex spelling can be, how many exceptions there are. And yeah, probably most aspects of vocabulary or most aspects of grammar. Part of that messiness is that we're thinking about patterns rather than rules. Now, that sounds a little bit formidable, a little bit different from the way that we have traditionally taught learners, which is a very rule-based approach. My second language is French, and I was taught French in a particularly rule-based approach, and then spent years realizing why those rules don't apply. If language is messy, what can we do? And my first suggestion, especially thinking at lower levels, is to think about what we say and what we do. Helping learners to understand that languages don't have the same rules as science, but that we're talking about things which often or usually happen. And we can regularly use those words, often or usually. Avoiding saying things like, you should always. Making sure that we say things like, we usually say. This often happens. Many of us will be familiar with those learners' questions when they say things like, can I say? And my answer would be, yeah, if you want to, but we don't tend to. We don't usually do that. That's not the way that we usually do things, but not because there is a rule that prohibits us from doing that kind of thing. There's nothing wrong with saying, I wouldn't use this expression myself, and it's not incorrect. Think of all those youth slang words that my niece and nephew taught me, which are words that I would never use personally, but they're not wrong. I would never use the word guys, especially if I was talking about a group of women. Doesn't mean it's wrong. There are lots and lots of different ways of expressing the same thing. And again, making sure that we're not trying to apply too much of a rule-based approach. And helping learners be comfortable with ambiguity. The more we focus on rules, the more learners will find exceptions. All of us will be familiar with a learner coming to class and saying, yeah, but I heard this on a film. I read this in a book. We need to help learners have an open mind to language. Again, patterns, things that usually happen, things that might not also happen. And my second suggestion is to help learners explore as much as they can, to explore language for themselves and to make their own discoveries. One way we can do that is by using something called corpus and concordancing. This is the more technical way of looking at language. A corpus is a collection of language that can be investigated, that can be explored. Concordancing means looking at how those words fit together, the statistical incidences of all of these combinations. If you have a look at the screenshot, you can see an example that came from a concordancing tool. One example, again, I've included this in the handout, which can be used, is a tool called Wordsmith, which you can see at the bottom. But there's a wide range of concordancing websites. They look at huge amounts of language and look to see how they fit together. And they mean that we can type in and investigate How are things really used? How does language really occur? So using a tool such as Wordsmith, if you're interested, then we can help learners find out for themselves and see how these things work. This all looks a little bit technical, and in particular, when I was working with teachers in my last job, which was in Egypt, I was working in Cairo, we found the most useful way was simply just to Google. Those questions like, can I say, is this used? Is this the way that we usually say things? Can be so easily answered by Googling. And here's an example. A bit earlier on, I talked about if I were. My feeling is it's being rapidly replaced by if I was. And I simply typed in if I was on Google to see what I'd find. I found lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of examples. Here they are. If I was, if I was dirty, if I was a worm, if I was a superhero. There's actually more incidences of if I was on Google than there are of if I were. And this is something that learners can do. If learners have a question, they can type in their own question on Google and find out. Ignore the grammar sites, ignore the sites that give you information about language, and encourage learners to have a look at how language is really used. These are all real incidences of language being used for real purposes. Simply type in a phrase, an expression, see what happens. But I was really interested to find out that of all the examples of if I were and if I was on Google, 2/3 of the examples are if I was, and only 1/3 is if I were, which kind of suggested to me that the use of if I were is disappearing. So, language messiness. Why is it messy? First of all, it's not rule-based, it's based on patterns. Secondly, it's something which is changing all the time. How can I help learners to tackle these aspects? Firstly, in terms of what I say and what I do as a teacher, helping learners to understand that these are patterns, helping learners to be familiar with ambiguity. And secondly, the kind of work that we're looking at here, making use of things like Google, making use of real examples, and helping students to explore things for themselves. I began by asking you to decide which activities were most like learning a language. Here are my own ideas, and this is what I think our aim is to help learners develop into these kind of learners. Firstly, learners who see learning a language as similar to riding a bicycle, or learning to walk, or learning to swim, visiting a new city, or falling in love. Helping learners become open to new language and taking risks, making use of their own instincts for language. Does it sound roughly like this is what people would say? But helping learners avoid being obsessed with rules. So, riding a bicycle, swimming, falling in love. There are no rules when you fall in love. The second group, making use of systems, the kind of systems that we use when we play the piano, or cards, or chess, or especially learning to cook. Helping learners see that these are patterns, learning from past experience, being prepared to be creative with language, but not getting frustrated when patterns are clear. So I think these are the kind of learners that we are aiming to develop. Learners who are happy with the messiness of language, learners who are happy with the unpredictability of language, and learners who are prepared to accept the ambiguity of the language itself. So, thank you very much. Thank you. And I think we've got time now for me to answer any questions that you have or any comments that you have.
That's great. Thank you, Andy. Well, that was so interesting. And I can see there's been a lot of really interesting discussion in the chats as well. So thank you. And I love your message about language is always changing. It's a living thing, isn't it?
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I was surprised actually by how quickly my niece and nephew could give me examples of things that I'd never heard of. So,
yeah.
It's all there.
It's amazing, isn't it? And I think Diana was saying in the chat, it's not written in stone, it's not dead, and it's that.
Yeah.
That's what makes it so exciting, actually, that it's there's room for creativity and things are evolving as people use it. Yeah. That's great. So we've had some interesting questions.
Okay.
One is related to what you were saying at the end about people have different levels of tolerance of ambiguity, don't they?
Yeah.
So Ailing McLaughlin says, do you have specific techniques to help learners deal with language ambiguity? As some of my students have very low tolerance levels to language irregularities.
That's a lovely question, thank you. And that's something that I've always dealt with myself over the years. And that was part of the motivation for putting this presentation together today, really, is that low tolerance. It's very common. I think it's because traditionally that's how learners saw language. But I don't think there's any magic answers. But I think coming back to what I was saying in the presentation itself, it's what we say and how we present things. If we're talking about this is how things usually happen or generally happen, I think that's one big step forward. And also making comparisons with things like the weather. I know it sounds a bit facile, but it's the same kind of idea. We don't know what the weather will be like tomorrow. Yeah. So there's a pattern to it. We're just helping them step by step, weaning them away from that traditional rule-based idea, I think, where you should always do this and you should never do this. Step by step by step. It is quite hard. When a lot of the ideas for the presentation came from discussions I was having with teachers in Egypt last year, and they were saying, it's a little bit frightening for learners at first when you think, there's no magic answer where you go home, learn this rule, and you apply it for the rest of your life. Wonderful. Okay? Yeah. But unfortunately, it doesn't work like that.
Yeah, and it can be. I've certainly felt that pressure as a teacher when the students have that expectation because they've been taught in those terms. These are the rules. So when they ask a rule about a specific thing, you think, oh, what is that? And I suppose it's what you do at that point. And I really like your idea of, okay, we're talking about patterns. It's usage. It's what people generally do rather than a rule.
It would be lovely if it was. I mean, if learning the language was as simple as just learning a set of rules and working through them, then life would be so easy. But unfortunately, it doesn't work like that. When I asked my sister, my brother-in-law, about rules in science, they were also explaining that a lot of the rules in science aren't true either. Once you get into things like quantum physics and things, way beyond my understanding. So maybe it's the whole world which is messy, not just the language itself.
Yeah, probably. That's quite a lot to have to deal with, isn't it?
I think it is. It's primarily, it's what we say, I think, and how we present these things. And you're actively encouraging learners to find exceptions as well. If you find an exception, it's a positive experience, not a negative experience, but it's just reinforcing how those rules work. You must have had yourself, you were saying, Joe, your own experience, but my experience has been where if you present things as a rule, the next thing that happens is that learners go back, watch a film, make notes of the subtitles and say, but he said in the film, I said, well, yeah, he did, yeah. Rule, you know,
yeah.
So again, I think that's a way of helping them overcome that kind of ambiguity.
Yeah, I'm thinking of the McDonald's advertising campaign. I'm loving it. That English teachers worldwide for years were cursing that because, you know, it changed language, and people do say I'm loving it, and it makes it more striking. Yeah.
I think just about all of those verbs that we often stress as statives and don't have present continuouses, it doesn't work. You know, if you type them into Google, you know, I was typing in I'm wanting, and thousands and thousands and thousands of examples coming up. I'm thinking, I'm understanding.
Yeah.
You know, the most of those verbs, I think that we describe the rule-based approaches that these are statives, they do not have a present continuous, just like you say, the McDonald's, I'm loving it, you know, they're all there.
Yeah. So actually the attitude in class maybe to that is, rather than, oh, that's inconvenient, someone has an exception, it's, well, that's really interesting. Can anyone think of any more? Let's look at them all together.
Very much so. Yeah. I think for almost every lesson that we do about a particular bit of language, we can do a kind of a counterweight lesson about why that language doesn't always work. And obviously that's too much overload at lower levels. But just like you say, just a little bit at a time. Yeah. And again, I think it comes down to things like, this is what usually happens. You know, usually I don't very often say I'm loving, but I can if I want to. And I can for things like McDonald's do for emphasis, or, you know.
Yeah. So for very low levels, or for students that you don't want to overload them with information, would you just kind of say, well, we usually do this, and kind of leave it at that?
Teach from the word usually. It's really, really useful.
Yeah, it's perfect. It's the best way. It covers you. Yeah.
I was working with a teacher a few years ago. His response to when learners would say, "Can I say this?" and his response would be, "I can walk like this if I want to, but I don't usually." You know, same kind of idea. You know, these are not things that they don't usually happen, but you might find that they do somewhere. You know, so usually can be such a useful word there, I think, to use.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, let's have a look at some more questions, because they're coming in thick and fast. I mean, if you want to, you can choose questions yourself, but I'm just looking through.
I know. Oh, yeah, there are a lot of them. Just have a look through.
Okay, there was an interesting one. Do you have any, this is from Raras Rumanti, do you have any suggestions for language learners who rely too much on devices, like Google Translate, for example, especially related to practicing constructing sentences, and they're kind of afraid of making mistakes, so they rely on Google? What would you say about that?
I think there's probably two answers there. I'm really interested in how what unreliable tool Google Translate can be. That came out of my own experience. But my second language is French, and I was translating for a friend of mine, and he wanted me to translate, put the car into reverse gear, and I was just on the verge of translating from this turn the car upside down, because it's inverse in French. It works on Google Translate. Helping them see however it's done in the Google Translate can be useful sometimes, but it's definitely quite unreliable. And you might well end up with what you don't. Giving them examples, I think, just like I did of the turning the car upside down, which I've used in class before. Where I almost got quite the right word, but not quite. It didn't quite work from there. But also, I think doing the kind of Google work that was on one of the screens I used, and in the I had questions from learners about if I were and if I was. And we actually did this in class. They got their phones out and just Googled if I was. And we looked at how many examples we found of if I was, and how many examples we found of if I were, in thousands and millions, you know. But two-thirds of the examples overall were if I was compared to if I were. So Google can be a really useful tool just to help you see how that language is used.
That's great. So some learner training about actually how you use these tools rather than just taking it. Well, it can't make a mistake. It's Google.
Yeah, experimenting. I mean, the obviously, if someone is, if a teacher is particularly interested in like technical aspects and using corpus and concordancy, there are tools for that. But it can look a bit formidable at first. And I found over the years just Googling things that worked just as well. You know, the example I had about 3 days is not enough to enjoy myself. That's something that never occurred to me before. And an Egyptian teacher asked me, because Prince Charles came to Egypt and said that something like 3 days is not enough to see Egypt. And her question was, can I use a plural subject with a singular verb? And my answer initially was, well, I don't think so. Until I looked at the example, I thought, my God, we do this all the time.
Yeah.
So, you know, Googling that kind of thing, how many examples can you find of 7 days is not enough, $10 is not enough? Where we can't, you know, consistently using a plural noun with a singular verb.
Yeah, that's really interesting. They're interesting examples. When you said that before, I was thinking of those nouns that I'm sometimes unsure if it's plural or uncountable, like police or company or staff.
And you know, they're both. You know, and they're both because there aren't any rules. The more I started thinking about it myself, I'm not actually convinced that there are any rules of language anymore. Because every time you come across one, you start looking, you can always find an example. I mean, I'm sure there might be a few, but I'm increasingly coming to the opinion that there aren't any at all, really. Well, I noticed a question here where it's from Amadou, I think. And Amadou says, sometimes learners find language frustrating when they come across exceptions. What should the teacher's behaviour be? I think this is all part of the message I was trying to get over, that if we talk about rules, learners look for exceptions. If we help learners see that there aren't any rules, that there are patterns, then the word exception doesn't really come into it. An exception is something that can happen, but happens less often than other things which happen more often.
Definitely.
Again, back to the kind of language that we use to express that.
Yeah. So maybe initially they might be surprised because they're used to hearing about that, but over time they get used to the idea that actually for patterns and things that can help us. Okay. So an interesting question from Marwa Lee. She says, if I teach young children in the primary stage, should I talk with them about messy language?
It's a really good question. I think you can. I mean, the one age of children that fascinates me the most is when kids get to about 6, 7, or 8. I was initially trained as a junior school teacher a long time ago. And the mentality of a 7-year-old kid fascinates me, because 7-year-old kids are, I think, more capable of taking big ideas on board than many adults are. So yeah, I think, you know, kids of that age, they can see language being messy. They can see that things don't always work that way. I don't think there's any need to go into vast amounts of detail. But again, I have seen classes in some countries where I've worked of, you know, kids 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, you know, carefully learning rules off by heart of language. So doing the opposite, I think, makes perfect sense. Yeah, I mean, obviously we can't go into huge amounts of detail, but getting that idea over that these are things that usually happen. Don't you ask us how old the learner are? You know, the idea is still there, I think.
Yeah, definitely. And like with everything, I suppose it's adapting to their level. They can definitely, you can primary age children, you can help them see patterns and things and go, oh, but that one's different, without maybe using a lot of meta language about grammar. And
but the actual idea of it, I think, you know, primary school kids can certainly pick it up. But I think it's surprising. It's often surprising how confidently kids of that age can deal with like big ideas, you know.
Okay, thank you. Let's have a look what else we've got in our questions in the Q&A. What have we got here? Okay, this is another interesting one. So Sirin Al-Shatif says, does this mean that we will stop judging students' proficiency in using correct grammatical patterns and appropriate language in certain contexts? This is a good one that we haven't kind of touched on.
Yeah, very nice idea. Yeah. One school of opinion would suggest that in the future, that might be the case. Because something I didn't go into detail, a lot of detail here, is about the whole idea of English as a lingua franca, which I think is increasing in terms of its popularity, where the key aspect is, can a learner communicate? Can a learner get the idea over, regardless of whether it's conventional or unconventional language that they're using? I'm probably myself a little bit more conservative than that. I think there is a place for some kind of accuracy, because if it's very inaccurate and interferes too much with conveying the meaning, so I think there's still a place for grammar to be introduced and grammar to be discussed, but not in that rule-based kind of framework. You know, there is a grammar of every language, and it does function, and it does have those patterns. So looking at those patterns and how competently a learner can use those patterns of language, I think. As an example, my third language is Spanish, but I've never learned it properly. I only learned it because I've got friends who are English who have Spanish friends. So I just learned it purely to communicate. I can get the meaning over, but the grammar is so inadequate that it makes communication quite difficult sometimes. Because I haven't really got my fingers around those patterns that you need. Yeah.
So we're saying we're recognizing that language is messy, but we're not saying that anything goes. It's not kind of.
No.
We're trying to help people.
As I say, the kind of the school of opinion is based around English as a lingua franca. I think is heading more in that direction. But personally, yes, exactly. You know, being able to work with the different patterns of language that happen is important. It's the difference between seeing them as like standardized, code-based, codified things that come down from the sky. There's quite a big difference there in the approach and the attitude to it, I think.
Yeah, definitely. So just to finally, because this is a related point and then we'll have to wrap up, but Anna Santos says, so in written assignments, all of those messy things, are they correct?
Good
this
point.
Is maybe interesting, because maybe sometimes we're more strict. We're stricter with learners than even we would be with a native speaker. That's okay.
Yeah, and it's a really good point. And I think that depends so much on the context and who you're writing to and the audience. And yeah, definitely there's a case to be made for thinking about that kind of formal writing. And it's how you project yourself and how the image comes over. Right. Again, I think it involves meaning as well. But at its most formal context, that would probably be the only context where I would say something like, if I was writing very formally. But the amount of time that I spend writing formally compared to speaking is tiny. So, but I think there is still a place there for that kind of work,
Okay, Andy, thank you so much. It's been really, really interesting. I know everybody's really enjoyed it. We're out of time, so we'll have to have to leave it there, but thank you everybody for all your really interesting questions and participation, and hopefully see you in 15 minutes for the next session, which is professional development is as easy as ABC, and that's with Abia. Yeah. So
thanks for coming. Thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Andy. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.